Well, look, before I go to Campbell Newman, I thought we'd have a word with Clive Palmer. Campbell and I talked about this last week. Put simply, the Labor government in WA has embarked on what could only be described as the single most extraordinary abuse of power in Australian history. That's not an exaggeration. A bill that aims to steal money from Clive Palmer. The fact is the Liberal opposition in Western Australia supported this legislation. If a government can do this, and you might think, oh, well, Clive Palmer's got a lot of money. Hang on. If a government can do this to Clive Palmer, they can do it to anyone. If the WA government can do this and get away with it, so can any government. It's a pretty simple story. Clive Palmer and the West Australian government have been involved in a long-running dispute over the rejection by the then Liberal Premier Colin Barnett of two development proposals for Mr Palmer's iron ore project in the Pilbara. Now, these agreements were secured by Clive Palmer from the Gallop Labor government in 2002. Colin Barnett, the Liberal Premier, then rejected what had already been approved by previous government. So Clive Palmer, as was his right, took the matter to court. In all previous arbitrations on the matter, the dispute with the WA government was resolved in favour of Mr Palmer. So another arbitration was set down for this November to determine compensation. Clive Palmer filed a $30 billion legal claim. The West Australian Labor government said this is more than the state's entire budget. So Premier McGowan earlier this month enacted unprecedented retrospective legislation. Put simply, it enables the government to virtually regard Clive Palmer as a non-person. Pay him nothing. But the Act exempts the WA government from the sanctions of criminal law. Now, this is unheard of. It removes all rights of appeal over any dispute with the WA government, and it grants the government and its officers immunity from prosecution. It's an abuse of the most basic civil right, the property rights of a citizen. Challenging anything the state might wrongly have done to Clive Palmer is prohibited. Today, Clive Palmer. Tomorrow, who might it be? Well, Clive Palmer today adds a new dimension, which is the reason I wanted to talk to him. I'm sure the public are interested in this. And he's on the line. Clive, thank you for your time. Are you telling me that days before the legislation was passed, McGowan's government signed a mediation agreement with you and the former West Australian Chief Justice Wayne Martin QC, and that negotiations were scheduled to commence, and you say it was, quote, settled for a fair and reasonable amount. So in other words, you thought you had a settlement with the West Australian government and the next day they moved retrospective legislation.
Well, that's right, Alan. It's very sad for our country. Everyone's talked about money, but we really need to talk about our country and what it stands for and the rule of law. I mean, to be exempt from the criminal code means that you can kill someone, you can break into their house, you can arbitrarily arrest them. And this Act also has the Premier having the power and authority to make legislation, make acts without references to Parliament. It's very similar to what happened in Germany in the 1930s. And this is an act that takes away all human rights from all people in relation to these things. So it's a very, very bad precedent for our country.
Clive, the Attorney General of Western Australia says that this will survive any test to it in court. Where do you think this is going to finish up?
Well, I think this will finish up with the High Court of Australia playing the role it has to play as a protector and defender of the Australian Constitution and the way that we live. The Nuremberg trials in 1947 in Germany said quite clearly that what happened in Germany happened because lawyers and the courts didn't stand up to the Nazi government. And of course, it's not an extreme thing when they're exempt from the criminal law. That means they've got a license virtually to kill you, to rob from you, to steal from you. They can't be prosecuted. Right. All public servants are exempt. So these sort of principles are un-Australian.
Yeah, quite. I mean, basically what it means, Clive, is when the government loses, just change the law. Now, I notice they're calling you a vexatious litigant. Haven't you won 12 successive times against McGowan and the Attorney General in arbitration and in the WA Supreme Court?
Yes, it's 12-0 at the moment, and they've lost everything. So the only reason we litigated was because we were damaged, that they did the damage, and the court found that we were right and correct in doing that. That's not vexatious. That's just ensuring that the rule of law applies, and we all have to respect the courts and the role they play. You may win or you may lose, but it's this legislation quashes all the court orders by the West Australian Supreme Court. It stops proceedings that are underway in the Federal Court, the Queensland Supreme Court, and the New South Wales Supreme Court. That says that no action can be brought to any court. So we can't even go to the High Court if we believe their act is correct. We can't even seek an adjudication.
Clive, wouldn't the bloke in the pub say, what crime are these ministers planning to commit next that would require exemption from criminal prosecution?
Well, the question is, what crime have they committed?
Yeah.
What crime will they commit? And of course, they ban FOI and discovery, so even the journalists can't find out what this is all about, what the documents are about. There could be some sort of conspiracy to get the resources of Western Australia for another country. They could be involved in that, but they're completely exempting themselves from whatever they're doing. So these are the very serious concerns we have to have as Australians. We don't want these type of laws on the books, regardless of whether I get any money or not. Yeah. That's not the important thing. What's important is that you, Alan, your family, other people have got their rights protected. Absolutely. That they can't be shot, they can't be taken away, they can't be arbitrarily arrested. That they've got to have decent rights in this country. I'm not the main consideration, the country is.
Yeah, good on you, Clive. Well, thank God you've got the money to take them on, because otherwise they'll just trample on everybody. We'll keep in touch. Good to talk to you, and thank you for that very simple explanation of what is a shame and day of shame from the West Australian government in the system of so-called justice in this country. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, God bless you, Alan. God bless Australia.
Thank you. Thank you. There he is, Clive Palmer. Now, each Monday we hear from the former Premier of Queensland, Campbell Newman. Campbell, just straight up, you heard Clive Palmer then. What are your thoughts on this?
Alan, as you are well aware, I've had plenty of arguments, legal stashes, political fights with Clive Palmer, but I accept what he's saying 100%, and he needs to be supported, because what is happening in WA is a total, utter disgrace and quite frightening. And I'll take a slightly different tack, though. It's a disgrace when Harvey, the WA Liberal leader, when she and her parliamentarians then back this odious legislation. So maybe this evening that'll have people sitting up and taking notice when Campbell Newman and Alan Jones are backing Clive on something like this. It's a critically important issue, and disgraceful what the WA government and opposition are doing.
Could be anyone tomorrow.